The Justice Beat is dedicated to the 1 in 3 Americans touched by incarceration. The Justice Beat is where we discuss all things justice.
Today's topic, Legal Hour with Judge William Billy Murphy Jr. Judge William Billy Murphy Jr. As the firm's founder and senior partner, Judge William H. Billy Murphy Jr. stands on a respected legacy of legal counsel. He has been a Baltimore trial attorney for decades, aggressively and effectively handling a broad range of ongoing cases. With a 90% success rate in state court cases, Judge Murphy knows how to navigate complex legal matters. He also holds a 40% success rate in federal cases, which is 4 times higher than the national average, 9%. His 40-plus years of practice in and out of the courtroom have equipped Judge Murphy to advocate for clients from all backgrounds and walks of life. Boasting a reputation as an expert litigator with a calm, calculated approach, Judge Murphy prides himself on getting to the truth. When you ask those who know him well to describe the man who leads a majority of Murphy, Falcon, and Murphy's toughest cases, you'll hear the words imaginative, leader, calm, and team builder. When you need a composed, precise, and effective litigation lawyer in your corner, turn to Judge Murphy. Amy Fettig is a human rights lawyer and leading expert on criminal justice reform who has garnered national recognition for her work on prison conditions. Prior to joining the Sentencing Project, Fettig served as Deputy Director for the ACLU's National Prison Project. At the ACLU, she litigated federal class action prison conditions cases under the 8th Amendment. Her practice focuses on claims regarding medical and mental health care in prison, solitary confinement, sexual assault in detention settings, and comprehensive reform in juvenile facilities. Fettig also founded and directed the ACLU's Stop Solidarity campaign seeking to end the practice of long-term isolation in our nation's prisons, jails, and juvenile detention centers through public policy reform, legislation, litigation, and public education. Fettig served as a leading member of the National Coalition seeking to end the practices of shackling incarcerated pregnant women.
Good morning, Justice Beat family, and good morning to our Justice Beat family on Real STL News. Welcome back to another edition of the Justice Beat Talk Show. And today's episode is our monthly legal hour with our moderator, William Murphy. We also have as our guest speaker today, Miss Amy Fettig, Executive Director of the Sentencing Project in Washington, D.C. Welcome, everybody.
Welcome.
All right, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. Today's episode of Justice Beat is going to be criminal justice focused, as was the last one, and I'm happy to have Miss Amy Fettig as our guest today. She's a superstar in the area of sentencing. Very impressive background. Can I call you Amy?
Oh, please do. Please do. May I call you Billy?
Absolutely. I don't like to be called William. That reminds me of my daddy, and I'm trying to escape my daddy's shadow. All right. So tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get interested in sentencing?
Well, I've worked in the criminal legal reform arena for decades now. I actually started working with women prisoners in New York City. Both women who were at Rikers Island Jail, at Bedford Hills Prison, but also when women were coming home and trying to reunite with their family. And I'll say I got involved kind of randomly. I started out actually working in international human rights, and I worked a lot with women in East Asia and in China. But then I had a domestic epiphany. I was going to school in Manhattan, and I lived about 2 blocks from Harlem. But at that time in the 90s, I never really went there. And just one day I woke up and I was like, wow, I've been working on the rights of women in China and in Korea and in Japan, but I don't really know much about women in my own country beyond my really narrow, privileged demographic. And so rather than take a job working on international human rights when I got my master's, I took a job working with women prisoners in New York City. And I'd never walked into a prison before. I'd never known anybody who had ever been in a prison before. And it was an awakening the first time I walked in to Rikers Island. And I spent a whole day with the women who were incarcerated there, talking with them, hearing their stories. And I was just blown away. And the moment I walked out of those prison gates, first of all, I have to say, with much shame, I just felt relief. I was like, oh my gosh, that could be me. But for the grace of God, go I. And then my second reaction was, I can't believe we do that to people in this country. It was a wake-up call for me. And I eventually went to law school. And then I worked for many, many years as a civil rights litigator, bringing cases against state prisons and jails about horrific conditions for women, for men, for children in our nation's incarceration facilities. And just recently, I joined the Sentencing Project as their executive director to really take on mass incarceration head on. And part of that, and I would say a huge part of that, has to be rethinking our entire punishment paradigm. Not only do we have too many people in prison and jail, but we put them there for way too long. Mm-hmm. We have to rethink this entire justice project. And I'm happy to be working with an amazing staff of people to do that.
What's the scope of the sentencing project?
Well, we look, frankly, at the entire system. We look at people coming in on the front end, and we look at what happens to them on the back end, and we look at what happens in the middle. Right now, we are focused in 3 issue areas, and all of them are permeated by our belief in racial justice. We look at extreme sentencing. In particular, the fact that we have more people in this country sentenced to life than we had in the entire prison population in 1970. And that has happened, that extreme punishment has happened in the last 30 years, frankly, while crime rates have gone down and violent crime has gone down. So we have to ask ourselves, what is going on there? So we concentrate a lot on reforming sentencing, especially at the extreme end, and looking for ways to deal with serious crime in this country that doesn't involve prisons and jails. Mm-hmm. We also are concentrating, and this has been brought home, I think, for the entire country in 2020 in the last election. We look at, frankly, the fact that voting rights are denied people who have felony records. Mm-hmm. But we believe at the Sentencing Project that the criminal justice system should never, ever mediate voting rights. People in prison should be allowed to vote. People outside of prison should be allowed to vote. The criminal legal system shouldn't determine our primary right as citizens in a democracy, and that's the right to vote. Because until we get the criminal legal system out of the ballot box, there will always be too much incentive, and we've seen this historically, to use the criminal legal system to disenfranchise Black and brown people. So we got to get that right to vote back, and we work with states and communities across the country doing that. And then our third bucket is focusing on youth justice. We want to make sure that no child is ever charged as an adult in this country. So we work to raise the age. We work to ensure that kids are not transferred to the adult system. And we also work to ensure that the juvenile justice system is not only humane, but it is as small as possible. We are focused on closing youth prisons because we don't believe that children belong in cages, ever. So those are the 3 big focuses of our work. There's a lot of work to do.
What is the most serious sentencing problem, if you had to pick one, in America today?
I think it goes back to our extreme sentencing. We hand out life sentences like candy in this country, and we don't give people second chances. So you see tens of thousands of people being sentenced, frankly, when they're very young, 19, 20, 21, even younger. We have 14 and 15-year-olds who are spending decades in prison. And then they don't get a second chance ever sometimes, or often until 30, 40, 50, 60 years later. So what we see in our country is, for the first time in our history, the fastest growing population of people behind bars is 55 or older. And that doesn't make any sense when we look at the research. And that's what we do at the Sentencing Project. We do hardcore research, and then we do advocacy for action and change. And what the research tells us, and this is true in the United States, and it is true across the globe, people age out of crime. The vast majority of crime takes place between the ages of 17 and 25, approximately. There are random flukes, but in general, people commit crimes, and they commit serious crimes when they're young. And we know why that is, too. The frontal lobe of the brain isn't fully developed. We have lots of neuroscience backing that up. It's not just people who are under 18, it's people who are 25 and under. The human brain changes over the course of the lifetime. And one of those big changes is that we just don't commit crimes when we're older. And yet, now we have the vast majority of people in our criminal justice system are now aging out of crime, and they never get a second chance to come home and be productive citizens in the society, even though we know people can. And that's because our laws are too harsh. We have relied on prisons and jails as the one solution to all of our social problems. And it's actually the worst possible solution we could come up with. So it's time to rethink the entire punishment paradigm. We've spent now a century thinking that prisons were the way to go. And we've proven over and over and over again that all they do is devastate communities and frankly cost us billions and billions and billions of dollars for no good reason.
To what extent does race play a role in our sentencing policies?
I would say it is the dominant role in our sentencing policies.
Why?
Because mass incarceration, you have to see it as a reaction against the success of the civil rights movement. When did mass incarceration start happening? The late 70s and the early 80s. There was a demographic bump, and so there was a bit of a crime surge. But more importantly, we see the war on drugs being used specifically against the Black community, and for a very conscious reason. And that was to deny them and slow down the political process that had started, a century earlier, as the Black community worked for the franchise, as they worked for political power, as they worked against the laws of Jim Crow that were both in the South and the North. And there was enormous success. The paradigm was shifting in the late 60s and 70s. And so to slow that down in a way that was not outwardly racist, the criminal justice system started to be used in a way that Jim Crow had been before. And so we see an enormous uptick, yes, of white people, brown people, Black people, but the consciousness of the public. The reason why it was accepted so broadly that we suddenly put tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, then millions of our citizens behind bars, was white people thought it was only happening to Black people, and they thought that that was okay. And frankly, then they looked away. And our criminal legal system has allowed Americans to look away for decades now, because you lock people in prisons and then you don't know what happens to them, and you don't pay attention to the inhumane conditions that they're exposed to, that the preventable deaths that they're exposed to, the horror and trauma that then they come home and they can't actually succeed because their ability to thrive as human beings has been taken away by the trauma of incarceration. That's a horrible system to set up, and yet we perpetrated it for decades now. I would say that this is changing, though. And the horror and the tragedy of the pandemic is helping us change that, because more Americans realize than ever before our prisons are a mess, that they are overcrowded, they are filthy, and they're inhumane, and that people are dying preventable deaths because we've failed to help them. We've failed to decarcerate. We've left them to die in these horrible places. That's inexcusable. Now, not everyone is paying attention, but more people than ever are. And I think combined, frankly, with the racial reckoning that we saw with the murder of George Floyd last year, and the outrage and comeuppance that the Black Lives Matter resurgence has shown to everyday Americans, it's time for change. There is an opening and a willingness to rethink and relook at received truths, like the received truth that we need all these prisons and that we need to put people in jail at record numbers. It's time to question all of that We have the opportunity to do it. It's just, are we brave enough?
What does your opposition look like demographically? And what are their primary arguments against what you're doing?
It's the same old argument that we've always heard. Do the crime, do the time. If they didn't want to suffer, then they shouldn't have done the crime. They deserve what they get. I think the primary argument that we see, it's more of a mindset. It's more of a mindset. It's more of a belief that people who are in the criminal justice system, who are incarcerated, are less than human.
Absolutely.
That is where it comes from. And that goes back to the system of slavery in this country. Slavery could not have been justified if Black people were considered to be fully human. That's the only way that centuries of oppression could have happened. And that same mindset is what went into building our mass incarceration system. Don't mistake it for anything else. It's exactly the same thing. And frankly, it's a result of the fact both of the success of the civil rights movement, but the fact that this country never came to terms with its past, never really admitted those centuries of oppression happened. I mean, I was born and raised in the North, outside of Detroit, Michigan, which is a terrible, Michigan's a terribly racist place. And I lived in a segregated town, but I was taught that, after the Civil War, everything was okay. And that the North never played any role in the system of slavery. That we were completely absolved of allowing centuries of punishment and pain. And in fact, I was never even taught that there had been slavery in the North. I thought there were good guys and bad guys. I didn't see it, and I wasn't taught, and I can guarantee you that I am not the only one. This is part of the American educational system, that we were absolved of our sins, that we came to terms with it, and we righted those wrongs. We never did. But we have a chance to do it now.
What was your awakening? About race.
Yeah. I would say it was my grandmother who, and I get emotional about this, but so she grew up in Detroit, poor family in Detroit, and I'm gonna go through a little history. She grew up in Detroit, a very poor family, and in the 1920s, Detroit, and up until now, dominated by the auto manufacturing companies. And as part of breaking the labor movement, what the auto companies did is bring poor Black sharecroppers up to northern industrial towns. And they pitted the white workers against the Black workers. And my grandma was a little girl, and her best friend was a little Black boy. She loved him, but her family decided that their child should not associate with Black children. And so they sent her to the country to live with her grandparents for many years. But she always remembered that trauma. And as a result, she became active in the civil rights movement when she was a middle-aged woman. And she told me about it. And what she said is, you've got to remember this, that racism is created. And you have to be mindful of it, because you will feel it the way that and she said, I sometimes feel it too, but I have to be mindful of it. I have to work against it. And I want you to as well. And so it was helpful to hear that as a young kid, to always keep that in my mind. And frankly, I worked in international human rights, but I was focused on international problems. And it wasn't until I was in graduate school, so it took me a while, to start thinking, what's going on here? Should I be paying more attention to what I'm responsible for as a citizen of a democracy that oppresses a huge part of its people? What can I do? And then again, when I walked into that prison at the age of 25, I was blown away.
Now, there's an emerging criticism publicly that has always been there privately, that white people don't call out each other as racists, and they don't challenge racism within their own communities. What's your perspective about that?
I think it's getting better, but I think that is a justified criticism. Because people don't check themselves. And frankly, my other grandmother was a racist. Though I loved her, and she's from Canada, interestingly, she was a racist. And it was really hard to hear. But her children didn't call her out. I started to when I was, and we had a conflicted relationship. But it is hard to have somebody you love talk in a hateful way. It's really hard. And we need the skills to do that. And I think increasingly we've seen, as families have become divided in this country over former President Trump and his politics, you've seen huge divisions in families. Those have to be worked out, but it shouldn't be about, okay, I'm just going to accept what Auntie Jane or Grandpa says. You got to challenge it. You can't let it lie, because that's what we've done in this country. We've looked away. We've tried to forget. Those problems don't go away. You could sweep them under the rug, but they come back. And so now is really the time to hold everybody accountable, to hear people's point of view, but also to challenge it, because a lot of people are being fed a whole lot of lies, and they don't have. They're narrowly focused, either what they see on Facebook, what they see on Twitter. They're not exposed to different people and different ideas. We're becoming even more isolated, and that is dangerous. That is extremely dangerous. So I say, challenge, listen, be respectful, but hold your line and hold your truth and speak it.
In 2017, the federal judiciary, what they call it, the National Judicial Center, is that the name of it?
Yes.
That keeps all of the federal statistics and does the federal statistical analysis of sentencing, for example, in the judiciary, came out with a report that was shocking and got no traction whatsoever. And this is 4 years ago. They found that Black people in the federal system, pound for pound, were getting 20% higher sentences than their white counterparts. Factor for factor for factor. So you take two similarly situated people, analyzing the factors across the board, and the study showed that we, as Black people, were getting 20% higher sentences than white people. And they did the same study for brown people, Latinos, of African descent, and the data was remarkably similar. Yet nothing has been done in response to that report in the federal judiciary. It isn't even discussed. Is that a correct perception?
I think that is a correct perception. It's also a correct perception of what we've seen with studies at the state level when we look at sentencing. For example, habitual offender laws, or 3 strikes and you're out, which often leads to life sentences. For example, notorious cases like you stole a videotape, or you stole hedge clippers, or you robbed a taco truck. When studies have been done at the state level, looking at who gets charged with habitual offender laws, because they're discretionary, what we have found in state after state is that people with very similar criminal backgrounds, very similar records, get very different charges when it comes to whether or not they're going to be charged with a 3 strikes or you're out law. And the dominant determinant of whether or not you are charged with these habitual offender laws is your race. So that Black defendants get charged with habitual offender laws, meaning that they get a book thrown at them at much higher rates for very similar records. It's all about discretion. It's all about the discretion of the prosecutor. And unfortunately, it's all about the implicit, inherent bias of the prosecutor against Black defendants.
Right.
Well, we hear that a lot, and there's no question about it because it can be demonstrated and has been demonstrated in study after study that there are essentially three places where racism is at its highest before the sentence takes place. First is police conduct.
Right.
The second is prosecutorial conduct. And unfortunately, the third is public defender conduct. Because what we see across the country is the deliberate underfunding of public defender offices and by the underpaying of lawyers. For example, Texas is just absolutely shocking. You know, the most you can earn as a lawyer defending somebody in a felony case is $750. Last time I looked.
Yeah.
And nobody wants that work, and you can't get justice. There's an old saying, you get the amount of justice that you can afford in America.
Right.
So since 90-some% in most jurisdictions are represented by the public defender because of the real correlation between poverty and crime. You see really, really poor lawyering on behalf of Black and brown poor people and among really poor white people. And so we see them populating jails even before they're sentenced.
Absolutely. Yes.
What can we do about that?
Well, like I said, we need to rethink our whole justice paradigm because there is no equal justice if you've got a lawyer who has caseloads of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of clients simply to make ends meet. And even if you're a really, really good lawyer, you're not going to be able to provide an adequate defense. And so, frankly, defenders and prosecutors should be funded the same. There's no question. And the fact that public defenders are unfunded or underfunded in every jurisdiction in this country, essentially, means that we are actually not investing in justice, that we don't believe it, that we don't think that defendants are worth it. And that is contrary to our entire system of innocent before guilty, or before found guilty. So we need to rethink this. But one of the things we also need to do is, I mean, frankly, we just prosecute too many crimes, too many low-level crimes. I think that Baltimore is an interesting example where Attorney Mosby has announced that she's not going to prosecute some of these low-level drug possession, prostitution crimes. And in fact, during the pandemic, that hasn't happened and crime has gone down. So we have to rethink how many people we're actually funneling into the criminal justice system. Another thing that Baltimore is interestingly doing is also providing crisis response from mental health providers rather than the police. I think that's absolutely critical because we know so many people come into the system because the police are the only people around, not because the police are the best people or at all a good structure in which to deal with mental health crisis. So cutting off the flow, having the criminal legal system not deal with the fact that we have no social safety net. So part of that is actually funding a social safety net so that people are getting mental health treatment, they're getting drug treatment, they are getting proper income supports so their kids aren't going hungry, so they are desperate and living hand to mouth. There's no reason for any of that in a country as rich as we are. That has been a choice. It is not a given, even though we've been told that that's what it is. No, it's absolutely a policy choice, and it's a priority. It's a priority choice. So instead of building prisons and spending billions and billions of dollars to throw people in cages, why don't we have community mental health care and drug treatment on demand and child care and job training? It's all connected. And it seems sometimes overwhelming because the system is so broken and interrelated. But you got to start somewhere. And we can figure this out. People are building societies and communities and making proper investments. The mess we are in, it has been self-inflicted. And the good news is that we can choose to stop hurting ourselves and instead investing in our communities and building them up rather than always tearing them down.
Now, there is a judiciary involved of human beings who are the ones who are actually imposing the sentences that are excessive. Yet the judiciary is almost absolved from public scrutiny in a systemic way. So to give you an example, there's some judges who are much worse than others. Yet the public is unaware of who they are. Now the lawyers know, but the public doesn't know. And they're not held accountable because there's this pervasive belief that once you are a judge, you have the discretion to do what you want to do without consequence. What are we going to do, if anything, to show statistically who the bad judges are, who consistently err on the side of sentences that are too high?
I think all of that information should be public. There should be no reason why that isn't available to the public and frankly to the judges themselves. You know, what I found over years of practicing in the federal courts is that judges often suffered from not actually having ever been to a prison. They didn't visit prisons. They didn't know what the conditions were like for the people that they were sentencing. There was no regular program to have them go in. So they were very, very ignorant of what it was actually like to be a prisoner in America. And I think it should be absolutely mandatory that all system actors within the criminal legal system, whether or not you're a defender or a prosecutor or a judge, you should be visiting those prisons and seeing what they are and what they're like, because that's justice in this country. And so if you think you are actually meting out justice, you should know what it actually looks like. Like I said, mass incarceration was largely built by the fact that people could look away. And that's not just the public, that's the people in the system itself.
Well, I get that. That's one of the things that judges ought to be compelled to do. What are the other things that judges ought to be compelled to do? In other words, do you have a list as part of what the outcomes are of your program of the kinds of things that we ought to be demanding that the judiciary do? Because they escape. They routinely escape. They don't even have it on the agenda in judicial education seminars. That's particularly true in Maryland. I guess you can count on the fingers of one hand how many times you've been invited to present before during judicial training that is usually yearly or bi-yearly in most states. How many times have you been invited to speak to judges as a whole?
Yeah, zero. And I think
that's
you make a good
scandalous.
point, Billy. You make a very good point. I think judicial education has to include not only what the law is, but what the law does. So, what's the impact of a sentence? Frankly, judges come from a narrow elite group of folks mostly. And so their exposure to the lives of others is pretty limited. And that shouldn't be, because they are meting out judgments for everybody in this society. So they should be very familiar. What is implicit bias? How can I identify my own racism? How can I identify my own sexism and work against it and work to not inflict that on others? So it's interacting with different parts of the community. They should be going into the communities that are impacted most by mass incarceration and hearing directly from the people, those who have been incarcerated, those who have family members who are incarcerated, to see the true impact of their decisions. Because these are real people's lives. And too frequently, I think in our justice system, defendants are considered numbers, or they're considered problems. They aren't considered people. And they're a docket to be gotten through rather than a life to be appreciated. So we need to change that as part of our judicial education. And we also need the public to know as well. Judges should know exactly how much their sentences are costing. Wouldn't it be better to, give $50,000 to a kid's family rather than incarcerate them for a year that's going to cost the state like $150,000? We do lots of things that don't make any sense. And part of it is because the actors involved don't actually see the costs, either fiscal or human, that are involved in their choices. That should be available for the actors in the system and the public that actually has to support these systems.
It's interesting that you say that because in Detroit, one of the members of the Michigan State Legislature, Black member, decided to add a requirement in the budget that every judge should, while or during or after he has imposed sentencing, tell the public the exact cost of that sentence. And so let's start out, and that had a salutary effect on a lot of judges because they had to start worrying about, when you can impose a life sentence, regardless of the cost to the public, because you don't have anything to do with the budget, you don't care about the budget. And so with impunity, you can impose life sentence. If you have to tell the public exactly how much that sentence is costing the taxpayers, you might have some response to these extreme sentences. And that was the experience in Michigan. The sentences went dramatically down. And because of that, the law and order advocates went back to the legislature and got that provision repealed. So it was very effective. Now, without belaboring that particular point, what reforms does your project advocate or to be directly requested of the judiciary? I mean, do you have a list of things that the judiciary ought to be doing differently? And if so, what are you doing in the sentencing project?
Exactly.
To impress the judges of the importance of these things? Because again, they always escape.
There are so many actors within the system that need to be more accountable. And one of our proposals, especially to deal with the fact that we have more people in prison for life than at any other time in our history, for no good reason.
What's the ratio, in other words, of all the sentences that are being imposed, or have been imposed rather, in the prison system? What percentage of them are life sentences?
Yeah, well, 1 in 7 people is serving a life sentence.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah, and if you are a Black person, 1 in 5. So that it's
wow, that much disparity.
Yeah, it's a huge. 2/3 of the people serving life in this country are people of color. It's very, very racially biased and driven by racism. So we just need to end this current punishment paradigm. And at the Sentencing Project, we believe that all sentences should be capped at 20 years, that there should be no sentence imposed on anyone that's longer than 20 years. There might be a few rare exceptions where someone is found to be a continuing danger to the community, a handful in the history of this country. But in general, what the data and science tell us is that 20 years is enough for pretty much any crime and any individual. And after that point, people should get a second chance. And that means the entire punishment paradigm should be ratcheted down so that our sentences are much, much shorter, and that we are not leaving people to rot in prison for decades and decades and decades, and that we are not turning our prisons into memory care centers and assistance centers. They should be focused instead on rehabilitating people rather than warehousing them. By
the way, getting to rehabilitation, my recollection as a practitioner that who experienced all of these generational shifts starting in 1970, is that the Republican Party, the Newt Gingrich branch of the Republican Party in particular, took the position that there should be no rehabilitation for prisoners.
That's right. That's right. In starting in the 1980s, there was this theory, quote unquote, that nothing works, meaning that rehabilitation wasn't worth it because people couldn't be rehabilitated. Can you imagine? Our national corrections mantra was, these people are irredeemable. It's not our responsibility to do anything to help them because no matter what we do, nothing is going to work. Now that flimsy research that was done was totally debunked. In fact, the researcher himself rejected it. But unfortunately, it was very politically popular. So what we saw
among whites.
Yep. Oh, yeah, among white people. Yep, you're right. So lock them up, throw away the key. There's nothing we can do. We're not responsible. That's basically what it was. We're not responsible. And it was very convenient because at the same time that this theory, quote unquote, was circulating, that's when mass incarceration was building up. And so the systems, they were overcrowded, they were overextended, they were in constant crisis. The only thing they could do was warehouse people. And suddenly they had a theory that justified why they were doing it. So it was a perfect storm to create absolutely inhumane conditions that were justified in the minds of the people who were inflicting them and the public at large.
Yeah.
So we continue to have to work against that because, quite frankly, in our prisons and jails today, and I've been in many of them, there is no rehabilitation.
None.
The program.
Oh, I can drink to that.
Terrible, and frankly, because the systems aren't held accountable for rehabilitating people. The recidivism rates in this country are outrageous because we set people up to fail, we send them back to the community, and we wait until we can play a game of gotcha and send them back to prison. Instead of asking ourselves, how could we have spent all these years, all these resources, all these decades, and come up with such bad results? It's a failed government program. And it continues to get funded year in and year out. In fact, it gets more and more of our resources, even though you've got 60, 70, 80% recidivism rates. That's failure. That's failure on an epic scale. And yet
And for many, we use these big words, and I think we can all benefit from the legitimate criticism that we got to break this stuff down so everyday people can understand what recidivism, for example, means. Recidivism is where you send somebody to prison and they come back out and commit other crimes. That's the definition of recidivism. And recidivism has actually gone up in America and in relation to the length of time people spend in prison, at least in the early years. And then if they spend way too much time and they get released, the recidivism is almost zero among the elderly who get released from these horrendous sentences. So tell us about what you think the vectors are that come from our criminal justice policy. And here I'm using big words like vector. What are the main causes of our within our criminal justice policy now that cause people to keep committing crimes after they get out of jail?
Well, like I mentioned, the system is set up as a game of gotcha. It sets people up to fail, and they do fail, not surprisingly.
But let's take it sequentially.
Yes. Okay. So what I would say is the first problem is when people enter prison or jail, the focus is not on how we're going to help this person return to the community and thrive. That's an afterthought if it's thought of at all. So folks who need drug treatment, who need mental health care, who could benefit from programming or job training, they don't get that. And oftentimes when they do get it, it's right before they're ready to go home. So for example, substance abuse disorder is a huge problem for people who are incarcerated. It brings people into the system and it keeps them there. But in most states, fewer than 11% of people who need drug treatment get it while they're in prison.
Right.
And mind you, this should be an opportunity to intervene. It's a crisis. Nobody goes to prison or jail unless they have a serious crisis in their life. And so instead of treating them dealing with that crisis, helping them get through it, they get nothing. So the longer your sentence, the less access you get to actually rehabilitative programming, and then you get dumped out into the community. And the community is set up to let you fail too. Parole should be supporting people to ease back into the community, get jobs, to get housing, to get skills, and to reacclimate, because being institutionalized is hard. People lose their life skills. But our system doesn't do that. Instead, it makes it so hard. Parole officers, oftentimes what they're doing is just waiting for the person to fail. Get a dirty urine, don't show up at an appointment. A lot of the people who come back to prison, actually, it's not because they committed a new crime. They violated a term of their parole, like a dirty urine or not showing up at an appointment.
Right.
Who amongst us?
Or not being employed.
Or not being employed, or not having housing that they weren't helped to get in the first place. So that's bad enough. But then we have laws put in place that make it very hard for people with a criminal record to reintegrate. You can't get certain licenses, you can't do certain jobs, you can't live in certain housing. Your family, if they're in Section 8, oftentimes they can't let you live with them. So where are you going to go? You're going to end up on the street. We put barriers in place to make it nearly impossible for people to reintegrate into society. And then we blame them for it. And we act surprised that they fail when we've done everything possible to ensure that they do fail. And at the same time, we take away the right to vote to people who are in the prisons or out in the community, sometimes permanently, as if they're not real citizens, as if they're not real people. And as a result of that, our political leaders don't hear and can turn a blind eye to the problems created by the criminal legal system, because the power of the people is undermined by taking away that right to vote. And that was so deliberate. And frankly, if we wouldn't be in this mess today, if we had a Black and brown community that was fully franchised and fully able to push back against the oppressive nature of the government.
Well, we need a white community that's going to be doing it too.
Yes, we do. And we had a white community.
And that's where we're falling short. I mean, I think if you look at who's upset about this, overwhelmingly, a higher percentage of Black people are upset about it compared to the percentage of white people who are upset about it. And, we do have at least 50% racism of an overt nature in the white population. And Trump reawakened it. And so we can see more clearly the extent of racism in the white community.
Yes, he did. And Trump has done an enormous amount of damage to America. But what he did do is reveal the deep racial fissures in America, and that latent racism that, frankly, a lot of white people could pretend didn't exist. And we can't do that anymore. White people have to stop looking away. We are responsible. I mean, too often that phrase, well, I'm not a racist. Who cares if you're not a racist? What are you doing to end racism?
Amen. Amen.
All right, can I cut in just for a second? I just want to make sure, because we got a lot of engagement on this episode, a lot of folks watching. From Ryan and Nicholas, do we have any questions that we need to attend to?
I'll go first. I've been checking in with the comment section the entire time, engaging with the people, and there hasn't been necessarily any questions, but it's been a ton of people. When you see these comments and they've laid out their personal stories, that type of issues that you're speaking on, they're far too many of them the same for comfort, and you can tell that there's a lot of pain and just unchanneled, just anger, because you don't know how to really fix these layers upon layers upon layers upon layers upon layers of issues that just aren't getting anywhere. And we cognitively know these issues, but there's just no change being done. So I guess my question on behalf of everybody that is having these type of like just issues and just unfortunate things happening to their families and loved ones. It's like, what could we do as people? Because systemically speaking, nothing is going to change. You can't just get rid of a whole system or anything. But what can we as a society, as civilians, can do to like get this like information out there more? Like, do we need to implement? I feel like we might need to implement more educational things in school about the judicial system.
Mhm.
Like how we always like advocate how we need to understand economics. We need to understand that, you know, regular people like me and everybody else in this group chat, we don't know about the judges, or even if they are up for election, we're not aware of them, or we don't know enough information about them. We don't understand the economics of like Black people when it deals with public defenders and how poorly they will like publicly try to defend like Black people, like because of the disparity of Black people as compared to a white person. Like we don't know these things. And so it's just like, what can we like do to like just get the information out there or make subsequent change on our end?
Well, let me tell you what I see in legislatures,
Mhm. Mhm.
because our legislatures have the power to change all of this.
Mhm.
And those are the people in our House of Delegates and in our state Senate. And we see a remarkable disconnect between the pain that these things are causing and the injustice of all of the things that Amy has talked about, and what legislators, even legislators of color, are doing.
Mhm.
There's this massive disconnect in the information
Mhm.
that programs like yours, Amy, are gathering in the data, and what legislators, Black legislators, know. And there is no continuity year in and year out that builds up the knowledge of, say, the Maryland Black Caucus, and an item list of all of the things that need to be addressed. And so that should be the easiest part of reform. And that is to systematically communicate all of these issues to our legislators so that we can item for item every year address them.
Mhm.
That's not happening.
Mhm.
And then in the southern states, we see this massive problem with gerrymandering,
Mhm.
because the red states are all controlled by Republican majority legislators, even in states where Republicans are not a majority. And it's almost impossible to get them to move towards addressing any of these issues. But where there is a chance to address it, it's not being addressed effectively.
Mhm.
So what do we do about that, Amy?
Well, people are doing something about it, and I share the audience's frustration with the many issues that we got to change in this country. But please don't despair, because people are acting up and they are acting out, and where we're seeing a lot of change happening, it is in the communities where directly impacted people. Folks who have been incarcerated, folks who have family members who have been incarcerated, are organizing. And they're going to their city councils, they're going to their state legislatures, and they're getting change to happen. So where I live in Washington, D.C., we recently passed two very important laws last year. One of those laws gave the franchise back to anybody who is in a prison.
Mhm.
So in DC, like in Maine and Vermont, people are no longer disenfranchised because they're sitting in prison. And that was a direct result of people in the community organizing and demanding the vote for their sisters and brothers who are on the inside. It wouldn't have happened without that community dedication. At the same time, and that same year, some of the similar advocates, again, people from the community, people who were directly impacted, moms, dads, sisters, brothers, organized to get a second look bill passed in DC. And what that second look bill does is it says anybody who committed their crime 24 years or younger gets a second look and an opportunity to go back before a judge when they're serving a long sentence to get released. And so, we did that actually. This is a continuation of a law. The first law was passed for people who were under the age of 18. And as a result, hundreds of people came back to DC and came back to their families. That was wildly successful. And then the organizers and the community said, it's not enough to just bring people back who committed a crime when they were 16 or 17 years old. We need to give a second chance to people who are 24 years and younger, because we know young people do dumb things, right? We all been there. And so they got that law passed, and now we know that hundreds of people are going to be able to come home as a result. They're going to be able to leave prison, come home, and return to their families. And that's a direct result of people on the ground demanding that their representatives change the criminal laws.
Well, I want to get a little bit more specific. We only have a few minutes left, and this has been a remarkably comprehensive discussion that you stimulated, Amy.
Thank you.
When can we get cheat sheets? Meaning a list of all of the issues we've discussed, a short summary of both the statistical analysis and the reasons why they ought to be changed, and a model legislative provision concerning that one issue that we can give to our legislators and say, we want you to pass this, and here's why. In other words, we'd like to get a model legislative reform package about all of these issues so that I can hand it to the Black Caucus and say, hey, here's who you need to talk to about this one. Here's who you need to talk to about this one. Here's the statistics for this one, and make it easy. Make it easy, because, as a person who works with the legislature every year, I see a re-education that has to happen every year.
Yeah.
And there is no institutional commitment in the legislature to change these things. Look, Maryland's a good example. We have over 40 Black legislators out of 144 total. We ought to be dominating the discussion. But what we see is ineptitude, lack of information, a lack of model legislation every year. I mean, why should I be the one suggesting model legislation when we have somebody like you and yours who can actually write the model legislation and make it easy for our legislators to have the correct language in these bills, the correct topic list in these bills, the correct backup for why we need these things, instead of us on the local level ad hoc trying to scramble to get this information into legislative hands. Likewise with the judiciary, we need a list of the reforms. And judges ought to institute institutionally to stop mass incarceration.
And whatever that looks like at the federal level, we need to model that for the states, so we can put something like that in the hands of regular people so they can begin their advocacy efforts in the communities that they live in.
Because Andy, it sounds like we talk to each other more than we talk to the people who can actually create the change.
Well, that is often a problem of folks who are working at the national level. But I do want to point people towards our website, which has a lot of this data, the Sentencing Project. If you state by state data, national data, it is on our website. And also, we do work with state and local partners around the country, and we have suggestions. If you're interested in passing a bill that gets people home or make sure that not so many people go to prison in the first place, please do contact us. We got a lot of ideas and suggestions for you. Every community is a little bit different, and it's important for folks at the community level to be the leaders. But we're there to support you in whatever way is best for you.
Well, I'm humbly suggesting, vociferously urging, strongly pushing for model legislation. And it can easily come from, it more easily should come from people like you and your organization than from people who are starting from scratch.
Right.
Oh, of course. And there are a lot of good ideas out there that have already been tried. Some have passed. So Billy, we've got some suggestions for you, some models that we can share.
Okay.
All right, good. I'm looking forward to it. And again, ladies and gentlemen out in the audience, you've been listening to Amy Fettig, who is the executive director of the Sentencing Project, one of the most influential, highly competent, very, very serious organizations studying these problems. And I hope that you have gotten a lot out of today's discussion. The more I talk to people like Amy, the more I learn how ignorant I am about how bad it is. I mean, if you've listened to this show and you are not emotionally affected, there's something wrong with you.
Exactly.
We're going to have to get you off of that Xanax or whatever it is that's keeping you from being responsive and get you into the action business. And remember this, it's never acceptable to do nothing.
That's
we
right.
all have to do something. So if any of this discussion moved you to do something, we're here to help you decide what that something ought to be. Now, Amy, is it proper for us to give out the phone number of your organization so that people can call, and the website URL so that people can, after the show, see who you are, what your organization is all about?
Please
and I
do.
hope that in short order, you will have a section on your website of model legislative reforms that we can just give to our representatives. Say, here, this is the shit you ought to be doing, and these are the reasons why.
All right. Yes, get to it. Get to it. Lots of work to be done.
All right. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you, the entire Justice Beat team. You guys are tremendous. It was so much fun, and what a great discussion. We got a lot of roads to cross and a lot of work to do, but
we left out some major aspects like healthcare in prison, food in prison, discipline in prison. We didn't get a chance to talk about any of those because there's no justice to these inmates once they get behind bars, and the food is terrible and the healthcare sucks.
Yeah.
Yes.
But we can always bring you back. I mean, we'll have substantive parts to discuss because this could be going on for hours. I mean, there's so many aspects that we need to talk about.
Well, I'd love to come back and chat with y'all.
Okay. All right.
We'd love to have you back. And I'm going to bring you back the moment that you have this model legislation.
All right. Okay. I'm getting up right away.
Push, shove, advocate. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Good.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Fettig, for joining us. And thank you to our listening audience on our show page, as well as Real STL News, for joining us for this episode on justice reform and sentencing. Thank you so much. We'll see you next
Billy
week.
Murphy. Bye-bye.
And thank you, Billy Murphy, once again for our monthly legal hour. God bless.
Thank you for listening to the Justice Beat. If you like what you heard and found the information useful, then support the Justice Beat Talk Show by spreading the word and telling a friend.